manually out to keep the pipeline running.
The packet thing.
I assume they made that clear.
I don't think it's
When you say it's not your, I assume they made that clear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I will grab it.
One cannot be free to yell fire in a crowded building despite having freedom of speech, or own a rocket launcher despite having the right to bear arms. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness require our country to occasionally call people to serve on juries, because it is our civic duty. These sacrifices of time and impingements on freedoms are necessary so our society can be better off. It is with this idea of societal betterment that we are resolved. The United States should have compulsory voting. A policy of compulsory voting we advocate would follow what Lachlan Umbers described in her peer-reviewed article, where freedom to abstain and penalties are extremely mild, but turnout is still very high. According to Umbers in the British Journal of Political Science, quote, "Citizens remain free to abstain under compulsory voting. They can leave once attendance has been registered or submit a spoiled ballot. In Australia, abstention is punishable by $20. Severe punishments are unnecessary. While evidence indicates enforcement is necessary for compulsory voting to impact turnout, most effective regimes do not impose heavy penalties. It will help make our society better in two fundamental ways. The first is the question of inequality. Non-voters are mostly young and favor economic redistribution policies, and on the whole, they support government-funded healthcare. According to Andrew Gelman, a Columbia University statistician, quote, "Changes of a few percentage points can matter. The two most common demographic features of non-voters are residential mobility and youth. There has been a huge shift of young voters to the Democratic Party. Especially given generational divide on healthcare, it's no longer reasonable to claim non-voters appear well represented by those who vote. Laley and Nagler find non-voters are much more in favor of economic redistribution. And it is no secret that the Affordable Care Act is under serious heat from the judiciary and the executive. While the bill is no savior, providing health care is necessary to save lives. Attorney Mary Gersich wrote for the American Bar Association Journal in 2018, quote, "Prior to enactment of the ACA, 3 people in our country died every 30 minutes for lack of health care. Since the ACA, that death rate has gone down, but is still present." But this isn't just about inequality in healthcare. It is also profoundly about inequality in earnings as a result of education funding. We will take the time to explain Christopher Rao's statistical model that demonstrates profoundly that if more people vote, more income mobility happens as a result of educational funding. According to Rao, quote, "I calibrate a model characterized by dynamic complementarity between early and college education to the US economy. Differences in tertiary education can account for 65% of the gaps in earnings inequality and 21% of the gaps in intergenerational earnings persistence between the US and Canada, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and the UK. Voter turnout explains nearly 1/4 of the differences in intergenerational earnings persistence," end quote. Voter turnout in America is substantially lower than what you'll find in most developed nations. Compulsory voting, by increasing turnout from the population at large, will sway our leaders to increase public funding for both early education and college. Rao concludes, quote, Voter turnout in the US is lower and skewed towards the educated. One policy to counter this would be compulsory voting. If everybody cast their vote, public funding of early education would increase and financial aid expenditures on college would augment. As a consequence, earnings persistence drops. This is not to claim changes to be immediate, as politicians take time to identify preferences. Economic inequality and health inequality are interlinked, and this nexus of social precarity contributes to 1 in every 3 deaths. According to public health scholar Stephen Bezruka, quote, "The factor most responsible for poor health is rising inequality in wealth and income. A political system that fosters inequality limits the attainment of health. Results are confirmed by many different studies. A recent Harvard study estimated that 1 death in 3 in this country results from inequality. Inequality kills through structural violence." The second reason we need to alter our voting rights is to challenge the rise of the demagogue. Donald Trump's rhetoric is unfortunately par excellence of demagogic rhetoric. This rhetoric directly influences people. Hate crimes are merely the tip of the iceberg. From Pat Buchanan's claims about the inferior race, to David Duke's direct hearkening to his KKK track record, to Eric Holder, former Attorney General, endorsing direct violence. When they go low, we go high. No, when they go low, we kick them. Joshua Holland wrote for The Nation in 2018, quote, "Nearly every metric of intolerance in the US has surged, from anti-Semitism and Islamophobia to violent hate crimes based on skin color, nationality, or sexual orientation. A study presented to the Midwest Political Science Association last month suggests that there's a causal relationship between Trump's demagoguery and those reports of racialized abuses. Empirical evidence that Trump's rhetoric did indeed lead non-Hispanic whites to express more bigoted views of the other. And while we cannot immediately unelect Trump or stop those who seek to corrupt power, we can enact a policy that would change that behavior by making inflammatory rhetoric unstrategic. Mandatory voting has the unique benefit of forcing politicians to avoid dog whistling and polarizing rhetoric. According to politics lecturer Walid Ali from Monash University, quote, "Compulsory voting changes who runs for office and the proposals they support. In a compulsory election, it does not pay to energize your base to the exclusion of other voters. Elections are decided by swing voters and one in the center. Australia has xenophobic politicians, but they dwell in minor parties. Australia has had bad governments, but it isn't nearly as vulnerable to demagogues. This type of rhetoric literally kills." Lisa Wade explained in 2015, quote, "Being discriminated against changes the biometrics that indicate stress and personal reports of stress. Bad health outcomes are the result. Area racism increases mortality among African Americans. The searches were related to an increase in the rates of cancer, heart disease, and stroke. This amounts to over 30,000 early deaths among blacks annually nationwide." And it is not just about stopping bad words, because mandatory voting is one prong of a larger push against hate and for systemic change. According to Derek Johnson, president of the NAACP, quote, "The system continues to place barriers in front of communities of color. A multi-pronged approach is paramount. This means a potential roadmap to mandatory voting. Evidence shows compulsory voting lifts civic engagement overall. Voting is how we will defeat hate. It is the key to systematic change. And racism and injustice must be rejected in all instances, as Albert Memmi explains in 1999, quote, "One cannot be indulgent towards racism. To give it a foothold means to diminish what is human. To accept the racist universe to the slightest degree is to endorse fear, injustice, and violence." Thank you.
Ready?
Yep.
Can you explicitly explain what your exact punishment would be?
So in Australia, it's a $20 fine. And if you appeal for instance, a religious exemption, all you have to do is show up to the polling place, claim that you have a religious exemption, tick your name off the list, and leave. It's just like showing up for jury duty and telling the court that you've done your obligation to show up, but you're biased, for instance, and then you get to leave.
So do you have any conditions to make voting access easier for people?
So there would likely be complementary reforms. For instance, in Australia, they do have election days on weekends to make it easier for people to vote, given economic barriers like having to work on a Tuesday, which is when we have election day in the United States now. But also, there would less likely be other issues and barriers like voter ID laws, because compulsory voting would be part of a multi-pronged approach, according to Derek Johnson.
Okay, right, so if I'm, say, a woman who's working 3 jobs and I have minimum wage, I have a bunch of kids, I have to take care of them, I don't have time to go to the polls, even if you extend it to the weekends, and I'm punished, and $20 means a lot to me, are you still willing to enforce that and force those groups of people, which it does impact, exactly hurt the people that you so want to help in these elections? Are you seriously okay with them revoking those freedoms?
So Australia has extended mail-in voting, but there can also be a hardship exemption for those that are in such indigent circumstances that it is impossible for them to pay the fine or to attend a polling place or mail in a ballot.
Right, but this also isn't Australia, this is also America, where we're a lot more diverse and we're a lot more harsh on our minorities, especially when it comes to
Sure, but the
deciding if
policy
things are
framework
okay.
would be the same and could, in fact, given American demographics, recognize a hardship exemption that may or may not be explicitly present in the language of Australia's compulsory voting system, but ought to be present according to LACLA numbers and others.
Okay, so do you justify taking away people's freedoms because you think that you get the benefits stemmed from the higher voter turnout? Is that your justification?
Well, it's that while freedom is valuable, that the idea of radical libertarian freedom is problematic. Because freedom in the United States, for instance, began by being built on the backs of slaves. Freedom in America has always had a cost, and we think now that that cost ought to be borne by the entire American population.
So
that is voting eligible.
Why can't we get the same impacts that you have through enacting laws that have better access to voting or that does helps anti-discrimination
Because
laws?
those would not increase turnout to the same degree. Only compulsory voting, according to scholars Hill and Louth, compared to alternatives, can actually inculcate a social norm of voting.
And what if the options you have are like the 2016 election of Hillary and Trump, and then you have people who don't want to be complicit in voting for people who aren't against their or who are against their identities, such as like a lot of black voters felt like they were being targeted or that they shouldn't be complicit in voting for people who are against their identities.
So Derek Johnson, the president of the NAACP, has indicated that compulsory voting is part of a multi-pronged approach against hate, and he even indicates too that the reason why voting is important is because if we aren't voting, others will speak for us. So it requires that, for instance, in Alabama, black women had saved Alabama from Roy Moore by getting out the vote, and we think that compulsory voting is compatible with those grassroots efforts.
Okay, but what I'm saying is it doesn't always give you the Roy Moore choice, right? There's also options where you're in South Carolina and your two options, or your two options, especially in this upcoming election. So you have Kamala Harris, who has this huge AG background and how she's been discriminatory towards certain minorities. It's not always the Roy Moore's decision. I'm asking you, is it still justified to take away the freedom of people to not be complicit in elections?
Fortunately, with the Democratic primary with Kamala Harris, there are going to be 20 people running, which means that you'll have so many choices in terms of being a Democrat. But otherwise, you have the opportunity to cast a blank ballot or a spoiled ballot, and those have expressive qualities because if enough people do that and vote none of the above, that will send a shock to the system that forces it to confront this wider disaffection.
So do you think that there's a do you have any proof that there's a direct correlation between people who have spoiled ballots, which is allowed in the status quo, and somehow making reforms based on that?
Well, if everybody had to vote and there are that many more people that are disaffected, they'd be forced to register that preference.
We think having more voters actually turn out increases the amount of low income and less fortunate people getting benefits from the society that we need to see. We agree that they get more health care and more education because the wealthy are the ones that are voting right now. But by going against the fundamental rights that we have as an American citizen to choose to vote is not the way to do this. I'm going to give an alternative near the end of my speech that gives us all of the benefits that they care to bring up, but still allows us to have the choice of voting. First of all, let's get into the ideas of how we're going to see a tremendous amount of backlash from the individuals who don't want compulsory voting. We've already seen major cases of voter suppression occur in the states that they've mentioned. We've seen it happen in North Carolina, in Georgia. We've seen active voter ID laws, gerrymandering, and other items come up to stop individuals to come and vote. And we think that these policies are only going to be exacerbated once compulsory voting gets put into action. We can see the majority of these tactics are being used by Republican people because they don't want individuals from the lower income households to come and vote because they know that they're not going to be voting for them. Because Republicans are notoriously against voting for ideals such as healthcare and voting for ideals that'll help low income people and the general population as a whole. We think that they're going to be stricter and more stringent on getting rid of the ability for these people to vote altogether. According to Andrew Grumble in The Guardian in September 2018, America has no clear apolitical body that actually allows an electoral commission to set boundaries. And this is exactly what we've seen happen over the last 2 decades. Gerrymandering is at the worst it's ever been. And there's no solution on their side to stop this. We've seen active voter suppression be at the worst it's ever been, and they have no active solution to this because we can see that individuals are still going to do the exact match laws that we have in Georgia and stop individuals from coming in and voting at these polls because they're not registered properly. And we think that we're still going to get these issues without a clear and concise way to show exactly how we're going to do this, which they failed to do. They claim the Australian system is the best to do it, but we don't see the vast diversity and the vast racism in Australia that we do in the US. We can also see that 65%, according to the same article, 65% of the population of the US are actually against voting compulsory. While in Australia, close to 70 to 80% of these individuals would still come out to vote without the compulsory identity to it. So we can't take these two systems and match the benefits that we've seen in Australia to the ones in the United States because they are fundamentally different. Next, let's go into the ideas about how not voting is a stance and the idea of a protest vote. Nowadays, individuals, as my partner brought up during cross-examination, are fed up with the idea of the single politicians that we've had. We've seen the most discomfort in our society with the elections of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. This goes to show just how important the idea of the protest vote is. Because if individuals can come out and say that we don't agree with either of these two politicians, we're not going to vote. We think that that has more significant impact than forcing these individuals to come in, even if they have a spot on their ballot saying that we don't agree with any of these. We think that this is the exact same result that you get in the status quo, along with the fact of an unsatisfied population having to come in and vote in general. This leads to a more dissatisfied society. I have two ways about how these unsatisfied candidates can actually lead to harmful voting statistics. According to Chitra Suparti, a Harvard scholar, she mentions that the median number of protest and invalid ballots in a society that does not have compulsory voting is roughly 5,000 per 100,000. But that number, 5,000 per the entire society. But that number gets multiplied by over 70 times as many people putting in invalid ballots in a society when it comes to compulsory voting. And we think that this drastic increase in the number of people who are clearly against the idea of compulsory voting goes to show just how bad of an idea this is. Next comes Dr. Michael Alvarez from Elections and Behaviors, professor at Caltech University. He has a theory of BNS, a blank, null, or spoiled ballot. Now, in mandatory elections across the world, individuals turn these ballots in at a much higher rate. He cites the example of Argentina, where Alvarez finds that an increase in these amount of votes actually led to upwards of a 30% population, individuals putting in 30% of blank or invalid votes. And we think if that's such a significant amount of individuals are putting in votes that show that either one, they don't care, or they're disappointed in the facilities that the government is pursuing, doesn't go to show an active representation of what's going on. Finally, I'd like to bring in this idea of how we can actually improve all of this on our side without getting the dissatisfaction of the American people. According to the American Center of Progress, we can see that they cite multiple examples that actually allow the percentage of individuals that vote go from roughly 50% to over 72%. Just through strategies such as online registration, early voting, pre-registration, allowing individuals that to vote at home through more mail-in ballots, having a restored right for formerly incarcerated individuals to come in and vote, strengthening civics education in our schools itself. All of these little tactics that we can implement that won't give us a massive backlash from our society will increase the amount of voters in our society as a whole upwards to 80%. And this gets that massive benefit of the lower income individuals that they want on their side without all the backlash on ours. Thank you.
Okay. Ready for cross-eyes?
Yes.
So I wanted to start first with civics education. If you were in a civics class and they told you that there are these things called juries, and in a world where we had a completely voluntary jury system, that you students could volunteer to sit through a lengthy litigious court case for a week or two and totally miss your job and all of that, how many more people would actually want to participate in jury duty compared to the people now who are required to show up?
See, the thing is, nobody wants to participate in jury duty. The idea behind this is, we can even look towards an example of my mother. She had jury duty the other day. She was one out of 50 other people that called in to get a selected jury of less than 10 people.
So do you think that people should exempt themselves from jury duty entirely? We should not make it compulsory for you to have to show up?
Jury duty is an upholding of the judicial system of the United States. It's not forcing people to sit in and actually participate. It's not forcing every single person to sit in.
Isn't it forcing people to be present and then explain why they should be exempt? and then explain why they should be considered. Or
A
have to
jury
be
does
reviewed.
not select every single person that comes in, even if they don't say that they're
Right,
exempt.
and every voter under compulsory voting does not have to render a decision on a candidate.
Right,
so
but
if jury duty does not disrespect freedom in that fundamental regard, then why wouldn't compulsory voting be just as permissible?
See, the thing is, most Americans agree with jury duty. I've shown that over 65% of Americans don't agree with compulsory
Who
voting.
says that?
Andrew-
Andrew, okay, so this guy's, Andrew Grunbull says that America does not have an independent political commission. Who's done a poll that says 65% of Americans said that if the U.S. had compulsory voting, they would not support it?
Andrew Grumble did.
Can you read me exactly what the poll question was?
Do you support compulsory voting?
Really, can you read that, please?
I don't have the exact website up. I don't copy all that
So
information.
you have
down.
not brought a card to the debate to present what the polling methodology was or what question they were asked.
You are free to look up this information when you have the opportunity. You must trust
Also,
that I am
who
not
did they
lying
ask?
about
Like,
this
what was their
information.
sample size? How many people did they talk to? Were they going from landlines, so they didn't really reach young people? Like, how were they communicating these polls?
Okay, and if you take that into account, you must invalidate almost every study done that doesn't take into account every specific demographic of people in the United States.
Well, no,
we think
because
that this
some
is an
polls are
average
pretty
study.
solid at getting
Right,
results, but
right,
I have no
but
idea
not,
what yours actually
Not
is.
enough people have the money and the influence and the time to actually go through and get the influence of every single person.
Speaking of polls, you said that in Australia, 70 to 80% of individuals would still vote even if their system had become voluntary. Wouldn't you say that it's because since 1924 people have been raised in a system of compulsory voting in Australia such that they have been taught that voting is a duty, and they were asked if that changed, would you still vote, and they said yes? Like, don't you think that's because of the policy?
We think there is a fundamental difference with the United States and Australia. That difference is that individuals in the United States have different laws, different outlooks, and different morals than the individuals
The
in
US
Australia.
and Australia have been longtime allies and both have democracies.
So
but I
have
want to
US and
ask you,
China, but
when,
they have they're
China's
different.
not a democracy, so that's
Okay,
irrelevant,
so have
but
US and
when
India.
has freedom to choose? India is also a pretty strong democracy.
Right,
When has
they don't
freedom
have
to,
compulsory
my next
voting.
question. Well, the United States should. My next question is, when has freedom to choose ever been unregulated in a modern society?
We have the freedom to choose in every aspect
But when
of
has
our
it
lives.
ever been unlimited? Because you have said that we limit freedom, and I'm asking you, when has freedom ever been unlimited in a modern society?
We limit freedom all the time.
Right, so why is
But not
compulsory
to the
voting
point
going to
where
break the
forcing
freedom
people.
bank?
We're not forcing people to do things by limiting our freedom. They have an opt-in system. There are punishments in our society that stop us from doing crimes.
Well,
that's the kind of
if
thing.
you
Not
send
voting
your-
is
if
not
you're-
considered to be
if
doing a
you
crime.
send your kids to public school, there's compulsory attendance. So if you live in a
have the-
democracy,
you
why
have
shouldn't
the
there be
option to
compulsory
homeschool.
voting? But
In that
if you
case-
live in a democracy of which elections are the centerpiece, why shouldn't there be compulsory voting?
You have the option to homeschool. In
But
that case, right? So in
You
those
also have the
situations-
option to not live in a democracy.
You can't tell people to just move out of the United States in that case.
Okay, are we all set? Okay. 1 in 3 deaths in this country results from inequality, which is a form of structural violence that begs a response. Fortunately, compulsory voting is able to provide a solution to these forms of inequalities in 2 ways. First is economics. Compulsory voting is essential to mitigate inequality in the form of economic redistribution programs that would fund education programs and financial aid expenditures which would augment, allowing a shift in the intergenerational earnings between young individuals and their families today. The second reason that compulsory voting resolves inequality is through health. Compulsory voting would incentivize younger voters to push healthcare reforms, as well as maintain the ACA and potentially create Medicaid expansion, which would resolve forms of inequality that you should prioritize. Now I will talk about their freedom arguments. Freedom is always constrained. We explained it earlier in the first constructed that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, can't yell hate speech in certain places, you can't carry a missile launcher. Unfettered freedom is an excuse for hateful behavior. This very ideal of freedom they embrace is endorsed by the radical right, who believes that carrying tiki torches is necessary to express their freedom. That freedom is always built on the back of others, and you should reject that. Since the founding of our country, freedom was built upon slavery, and now free hate speech is built upon sacrificing the health of those who experience it. Their idea of freedom kills. You as a judge cannot ethically accept that side. Each of us has a responsibility to speak out against racist, homophobic, and sexist comments, among others. Your ballot for our side does that by resisting the demagogue and Trump. Intolerance has surged with Trump, such as anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, sexual orientation discrimination, and racialized hate crimes, which all creates forms of stress and literally kills because it incentivizes and increases the risk for those individuals to get diseases. Compulsory voting changes who runs for office and the proposals that they would support. Xenophobic politicians dwell because their movements would get drawn out gradually, proven by Australia. Our compulsory voting also forces civic engagement, which can create systematic change to resolve forms of oppression. Now, we don't create voter suppression. People can opt out if they have a religious exemption. They can leave once attendance is registered, or submit a spoiled ballot, which is what our first constructive Umbers piece of evidence describes. Now, obligations such as jury duties violate in the status quo principles of freedom. It is an obligation that we have to contribute to our democracy, however, which means that you should prioritize those forms of violations of freedom, even if they do violate some forms of freedom, because the benefits just outweigh. Now, there's never unconstrained freedom either, which was proven in the cross-ex, and demonstrates that there's no specific threshold for them to win any of these arguments. Now, our opponents suggest that there's a right not to vote. This neglects our duties in a democracy to fulfill the values that all citizens share, which is why we pay taxes or follow the speed limit, according to Lockie and Umbers, a philosophy lecturer at the University of New Southern Wales. Proponents of compulsory voting appeal to values all citizens might reasonably share, e.g. equality and fairness. If laws compelling citizens to pay taxes or obey the speed limit are not rights violating, it seems unlikely what compulsory voting is rights violating. Now, the ability to cast blank or spoiled ballot means that compulsory voting does not restrict freedom of speech, according to politics lecturer Waleed Alai. Americans already have many obligations like taxes or jury duty. The argument that compulsory voting violates freedom of speech misunderstands voters are obliged to turn up. Leave your form blank. Draw pictures. By tracking these informal votes, we can gauge voter dissatisfaction. Now, you should be super skeptical of their polls because they can't explain a methodology of how it was conducted or what the sample size is, which means that you should give this argument zero weight until they read a piece of evidence or explain their arguments. But even if you grant them these arguments, the norm that we create with compulsory voting is still good and benefits all. Finally, they have proposed some different counter proposals that could achieve the same ends. This debate is about whether or not the U.S. should adopt compulsory voting, not what are all the different ways you can change the United States. While a set of unique ideas, you as a judge should not consider this world where they get to wave a wand and envision a different status quo that does not exist. Why not do both? Australia has a national holiday, and we can complement compulsory voting with complementary reforms, such as amending online registration and the other proposals that they have advantaged. However, their proposal encourages dog-whistling rhetoric in order to get people to turn out. The major advantage of compulsory voting is that it changes the objective from getting out the vote to convincing you have good ideas, which shifts the conversations to the best policies. Now, voter turnout increases and forces politicians to listen to the will of people. Fusion Media Research noted voter turnout in the U.S., the linchpin of that democracy, ranks among the lowest. Mandatory voting laws certainly appear to boost turnout in Australia. Natural polls suggest that the official policy platforms don't always conform with public opinion, something that might change if everyone voted. One place that this would have immediate impact upon is universal background checks. The Hill reported in February of this year, 97% surveyed supporting requiring background checks for all gun buyers, while just 2% were opposed. This is an issue that candidates would have to follow through on, according to a Giffords 2018 gun violence poll that says a survey of 1,500 likely 2018 voters in 38 districts, include 34 Republican-held districts, embracing gun safety could be a difference maker for Democrats in key swing districts. Support for stronger gun laws remains high, and NRA's favorability is on a downward trend. Among voters who support stronger gun laws, 70% are likely to consider a candidate's stance on guns. This would save 90 lives a day, according to Andrew Gallia, Dean of School of Public Health at Boston University, says 90 people die of gun-related injuries in the U.S. each day. Nationwide adoption of background check laws could reduce gun-related deaths by as much as 80%.
Okay. So when you can still get a majority of individuals, upwards from 75 to 80%, to come out and vote by enacting simpler policies that won't upset a population, why is it necessary to still have compulsory voting?
because it creates a norm to establish voting. All of our arguments from the first constructives indicate how we need to have compulsory voting to change the conversation away from a demagogue who can capitalize on the fact that there's
Right.
tons of voters that
Right.
don't vote or
By
can
having-
stop the demagogue.
Right, by having by having more teaching activities in society, in our
It's
schools.
not just teaching
I
activities.
know it's not just
also,
teaching activities. It's actually having pre-registration. It's having online registration. It's
Yeah,
making
which
it
is
easier
compatible
for
with
individuals.
compulsory voting.
Right, but it doesn't give you the backlash of individuals disagreeing.
Well,
with
this
compulsory
presumes
voting, right?
that your backlash argument is carded or substantiated by a
Okay,
piece of evidence.
Say even
but
if the
you
majority
have
of
no
the individuals, say
evidence that
45%
substantiates
of the
that.
individuals, dropping our statistics significantly and benefiting you, even if 45% of the individuals don't enjoy it, and they cast invalid votes, what is the difference with having our current status quo
So-
and having
Yeah.
invalid votes in the first place?
So
you
at
get
the,
no benefit.
At the top, I explained how we can pursue different reforms such as economic redistribution programs that would fund education programs, as well as pursue healthcare reform to increase the health of individuals in the United States.
But isn't that not exclusive to your side? Because with our side, by having more individuals vote, which you've agreed
Our
happens.
evidence does a statistical analysis of how compulsory voting mandates economic redistribution programs and would incentivize voters to pursue those reforms and pursue candidates that would pursue those reforms because they desire to do so.
Right, and by having more voters in general promotes those same activities. Because having more low-income voters asks them to act in their own interest, having health
Well,
care and these
compulsory
kinds of
voting
things go
is
into
the
place,
key
correct?
factor to resolve all of these issues that we all agree are important because it creates a norm that we need to set out and vote and create these policies in the first place.
But
Otherwise,
compulsory
those
voting also increases the amount of invalid ballots that are there. It decreases the amount of willing participation, and it overall hurts the nation.
well, we would disagree with all of those portions. First of all, is that tons of violations of
Wait,
freedom
you've
already exist.
you've already agreed that it increases the number of invalid votes, correct?
Well, that is an option. It doesn't mean that everyone will do it.
But, okay, then you can go on the other side as well, saying not everyone is going to be voting for the individuals that they want to.
Well, it's mandated by compulsory voting that everyone would turn out,
Turn
unless there's
out, not vote.
exceptions.
Turn out, not vote. Just
They
like you
would-
said, they have the
They
ability
would turn
to draw
out,
whatever
which
picture
is
that
what
they want.
all of our
which is-
offense is predicated upon.
If you're being forced to do something, how likely is it that you're actually going to be doing in-depth research on what these candidates want?
Sure. So our evidence does actually a statistical analysis.
Can you give us
of,
the numbers?
Yeah. Could you get the Rowley?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's a model characterized by dynamic complementarity. Voter turnout explains.
Yeah. Voter turnout explains nearly 1/4 of the differences in intergenerational earnings persistence.
And that's the clear thing that I'm trying to say. Our side still gets you an increase in voter turnout like you want, but it doesn't have like a negative influx of ballots coming in that are blank.
Well, those ballots would still exist, but we still mandate a form of voting that would resolve the forms of violence that we have presented.
According to the American Policy of Progress, we get through pre-registration, online registration, early voting, not excuse
Those are all
absentee
compatible
voting,
with compulsory voting.
but it doesn't get you that backlash, and it doesn't infringe upon the freedoms
Well,
of the
this
American
all
people.
presumes
That's
that you
the
have an
crux of this
argument
argument.
about backlash, which you don't.
Then we fundamentally disagree. Wait, no, you don't disagree with that because you also agree with the idea
Well, we
that
also-
individuals come in and
We've
give
read
blank ballots.
evidence that
they agree
indicates
with that.
turnout would come and incentivize people to vote.
Why can't we have those incentivizations on our side without getting an increase in invalid votes?
Because our argument is that both of those are compatible and inevitable.
That's not possible.
What we see today in today's debate is all about what is freedom, how far can we go to limit it, and are the outcomes of compulsory voting really worth the backlash that we've tried to prove to you today? We think that there's going to be two things that are going to happen. One, we think in a best world where they are able to increase the amount of votes, we think those votes are useless because we're going to show you exactly how uninformed votes and BNS votes undermine the exact impacts they claim to get. And then second, in the world where they do end up getting like real actual votes, why even if you get an increase in votes, you're still taking away the fundamental freedom of your freedom of speech, which is exactly what this ability to choose not to enroll in this is doing, because a vote is an act of freedom of speech. When you take that away, of the ability to choose whether or not to do it or to do it, I think you're fundamentally taking that away. So specifically going on that point, like why is this not something that we can limit, right? So they come up here and they say, we limit the freedom of the speech all the time. We don't think that, or we limit freedom all the time. We think freedom of speech is not limited to this extreme before. We think this sets precedent for the government to like be able to like further infringe on our rights, like to be able to have our own form of like speech, right? We think that yelling fire in a theater or saying like hate crime in a certain person is illegal because you are infringing on the rights of others. You're putting the safety at risk of others. This itself is your ability to decide and to govern for yourself whether or not you want to participate in a thing, in an election. We think this is not under the same category of other reasons why we limit freedom of speech. Their umbrella of how we limit freedom of speech does not take into account why we do those things. It does not take into account how far we're willing to go, or the backlash, or like how it harms individuals themselves, right? So the idea that you can just limit freedom of speech however you want just because it happens in the first place isn't good enough. Second, we hear like the benefits they're going to get is economic redistribution, better healthcare reform, education, and things like that. We think this only occurs insofar as you are actually able to get quality votes of people who actually hold those beliefs, or of people who are actually filling out the votes. I'm going to explain to you why in my last point that doesn't happen, because one, you have protest votes, which are increasing in all like countries that have actual compulsory voting countries, right? And second, we think that people who, when you look at certain statistics, you see that a lot of non-voters actually don't know or care about politics. So when you say that you're going to get this good quality vote, people don't give a fuck. What they do is they vote for people who have like white names, or they have simple names, or it's like the donkey ballots, right? We think that's where you get the idea from it. So the idea that you get rid of Trump's rhetoric by forcing politicians to be less polarizing goes with the same idea that you only have it when you have quality votes. Then you hear the idea of like our duty as a citizen only matters if it's our duty as a citizen to participate in elections, and they try to compare this to juries. We want to say that like being a part of a jury and deciding if someone should go to jail or like not is not the same as deciding if you have to participate and deciding who governs over you if your choices are both corrupt, right? We think those two are not the same things. We think our duty as a citizen only goes as far if the government is willing to do their part. The second that you show that there's voter suppression, that there's not equal like access to voting, is exactly when the duty as a citizen it doesn't need to be upheld. We think and the idea that we can't give an alternative like of laws because like that's not the debate is not facing the fact that we can do just as much impacts as their side without forcing people punishibly to actually enact or to participate in these things, right? So first, like on the idea of the backlash from the right, that's exactly what our backlash is, right? So we can tell you, like in the current status quo, a lot of times the right will often use the right party will often use voter suppression in order to like try and gain control and gain power within the seats, right? For example, like Zoltan Hajnal, like professor at the University of Chicago, who like specializes in scholarly articles about racial and ethnic politics, talks about how a lot of times voter ID laws serve as effective barriers that limit the legitimate participation of racial and ethnic minorities, right? We think that a lot of times it's found that Republicans tend to respond to certain like loss of control in seats or loss of power by enacting harsher voter suppression. When you look at the idea of North Carolina and Georgia and how they're creating harsher gerrymandering laws, we think this is all responsive to the idea that they're losing control, right? Second is the ability not to vote is more than a right, it's a freedom of speech, right? So we think that like in Brazil, both candidates were corrupt, similar to the 2016 like US election in most people's eyes, right? So from somebody who actually lives in Brazil, and he's the director of the King's College Brazil Institute, Anthony, he shares his experience, and he says that if voters are left with a choice between a far-right extremist and a man seen as a symbol of establishment-sanctioned corruption, Brazilian democracy may suffer. The fact that you are not giving an actual choice between two fair people, it undermines your democratic principle of having a fair election. We think that you shouldn't be forced to choose between candidates that are fundamentally against your values or your identity, right? Because that's not a genuine, like, actual election, and that undermines the democracy that they so much stand for. Second is a protest vote, right? We think that like instead of voting for a party or a candidate listed on the ballot, voters instead intentionally cast blank, null, or spoiled ballots, right? In response to disenfranchisement or due to other political considerations, political elites and political participants lead campaigns to encourage protest voting, right? So we think that this can undermine the effectiveness of increased voter participation and can undermine the impacts that they try to tell you that they get, right? And according to Dr. Michael Alvarez in a study that he does, BNS ballots are cast at a higher rate in mandatory electoral regimes than in non-mandatory ones, presumably by voters who would rather otherwise not turn out to vote. The fact that people don't want to vote in the first place, it shows you that when you try to force them into it, they're going to react by not participating in this. The entire benefits and impacts that they want to tell you about, the healthcare, the education, the economics, doesn't occur if they don't get the super big increase in voter turnout that they want, right? We think that a lot of times the second thing that happens is uninformed votes can dilute the democracy and the benefits that they want, right? People who don't vote don't have an interest in politics and therefore are uninformed, right? In a U.S. Census Bureau in 2014, 28% of non-voters said they were too busy, 10% were out of town, another 16% weren't interested in the election, and 8% didn't vote. For more than 60% of non-voters, this election wasn't a priority because they don't care. We think that when you dilute the democracy in the voting with people who don't care, you don't get quality benefits. We think that they don't get the benefits that they want, and you instead get a lot more backlash. Thank you.
Okay, so you said that Republicans, in response to voter suppression, create policies such as gerrymandering in order to respond to the voter suppression that has occurred. Why is that true?
Okay, so actually in a study done by Zoltan Hajnal, he talks about Trump's attempt to once again strip the Voting Rights Act and talks about how this is a response to the blue wave of the Congress coming in.
Okay, so why don't we resolve that if we tarnish that rhetoric that we need to revoke the Voting Rights Act
And
in
that
the
only
first
happens
place?
if you get quality votes and an increase in quality votes. But when you
Okay,
allow
so
none of the above, or you allow BNS votes, then you don't get those
So I
impacts
guess this just comes down to the uninformed voters question. What evidence
Or
demonstrates...
protest votes.
Okay, how many protest votes would be sufficient to diminish the value of compulsory voting?
It grows each year. I don't think it necessarily has to be just one
Why is
election.
why is that true that it grows each
So
year?
actually, protest votes have been increasing specifically in Brazil and Argentina, right? So we
Why are
think
those comparable to the United States?
because we had Trump and Hillary as our two candidates, and right now we think that's comparable to
No,
Brazil
no.
to a lot of people.
Okay, why, so is it just how many protest votes are sufficient to be to the detriment of compulsory voting? Like how many
So
do we need? How
one,
many
if you
need
say
to
that your
exist?
punishment's not that big of a deal, which you've already said in your first speech, then you already don't have enough incentive to get people out to vote. Second, if you have at least even just
So
a
it's
12,
just-
13% of protest votes, that
So
still
the
undermines
protest
the exact
vote-
benefits that you want.
The only reason why people protest vote is just because the sanction isn't that bad?
No, protest vote is when you actually vote. Protest vote could be for a number of things. You're not okay with the candidate, you're not okay with the corruption of the government, you're not okay with the voter suppression,
Okay.
all things that are exacerbated under your model.
Okay, a lot of non-voters are marginalized. Do their votes not matter?
No, they do matter, but in your world, you're actually punishing them if they don't have the opportunity to go out and vote. We think that you actually can
Why
have...
is that true though? Why would
You can get more access to you can give them better access to votes under our world as well. You just don't force them to and then punish them if they don't. We
So
think
under
their
your
freedom
world,
is
what do you
intact.
do to increase the access of marginalized people to voting?
A bunch of things that have already been proposed, even in the status quo, like online voting, automatic registration, civic
Those are
classes.
all compatible with compulsory voting.
Yeah, except we don't force them to vote and punish them if they don't.
Okay,
That's the
so
key
what do we
difference that we're not
determine
okay with doing.
what is forcing someone to vote? Is it just why do we
It's
force someone
if they
to
don't
vote
want to
if they
come out
just
and
need
vote
to
for
show up?
whatever reason they want, and then you make them pay $20, which may not seem like a lot in your definition, but to someone who's
Why does
working on a
it
minimum
violate
wage to pay for
freedom
2
if they
kids,
just-
that's everything.
Why does it violate freedom if they just need to show up for attendance purposes?
You're making them get out of their house to cast something that's literally useless in your world. That's taking
Why is
away.
it useless to them?
If it's going to be an invalid or protest vote, then what's the point of doing it at all? If it does the exact same effect to just not come out at all, you're
So-
taking away their ability
So
and their
that
power to take a
presumes like
stance
the
against government.
individual themselves don't value things like healthcare or education reform that can benefit other people. So we should
Doesn't
just
mean that they don't
disavow it.
necessarily value it. They just know that they probably know that because of voter suppression laws, that their vote doesn't matter. Like
So
gerrymandering,
why would
vote in South Carolina for healthcare
So-
may not mean anything.
how would an alternative world resolve those instances of voter suppression?
I don't think it necessarily solves all of them. I think we can potentially do it, but your side exacerbates it in the exact same analysis that I gave you when I first constructed.
So if we can't resolve it, why should we opt out entirely from voting completely?
I don't think we should opt out entirely. I think we should be given the choice to if we want to, because we think voter suppression, by not turning out, you can also be giving a stance against the fact that voter suppression exists.
So why does that stance uniquely enhance democracy or send a signal to
Because
candidates to change?
some of the principles of democracy are inclusion, minority rights, popular sovereignty. None of those exist as long as your side exacerbates voter suppression.
Okay, we have 2 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Survive? Can freedom be enjoyed by all, unless everyone in a democracy has borne the costs of freedom? The version of voting rights they subscribe to depends upon the libertarian freedom supported by the radical right, which produces inequalities along economic, educational, health, and racial lines. Economic and health inequality produce a nexus of social precarity, which leads to 1 in 3 deaths in the US, and the racial resentment that is stoked by demagogues like Donald Trump in a world where the priority of getting out the vote is by energizing your extreme base, rather than focusing on policy ideas in a world where everybody has to turn out and then you have to focus on the median voter, means that there are people that are dying every day from hate speech that is stoked by these candidates. And that means that there is a material cost to the con team's shallow version of democracy where the will of the people is not actualized. In fact, they have not contested that if the will of the people were more adequately recognized, which it would under compulsory voting, because everybody has to vote, it means that official policy platforms would conform with public opinion. There are multiple implications. It would save the Affordable Care Act. It could lead to Medicaid expansion. It would ensure that there'd be more financial aid for college and more money invested in early childhood education, all of which would reduce the intergenerational earnings persistence that is undermining social mobility. It would also lead to universal background checks, because we provide actual polls that demonstrated, for instance, Quinnipiac found that out of over 1,200 voters, 97% of them support background checks, and that over 70% of voters care especially about a candidate's stance on guns. In addition, a poll surveyed 1,500 voters in 38 districts, including 34 that were pretty red, and found that a vast majority of them care about gun safety, and that would be the deciding factor in their vote. There are lots of people who don't vote for a variety of reasons, because maybe they feel disillusioned, maybe they feel like no candidate really speaks to them, or maybe they're busy, or for any other various reason. Maybe they're young and aren't very educated in civics, or uninformed. But at the end of the day, compulsory voting not only inculcates the social norm that voting is a civic duty, there are also complementary multi-pronged reforms that can improve accessibility, such as improving automatic voter registration, or by getting rid of voter ID laws, or by expanding mail-in voting or digital voting. All of that is compatible with a system of compulsory voting, even making Election Day a national holiday, which is what Australia has done. But for the negative to wave their wand and envision a world where all of that happens, but we just don't have compulsory voting, is not the focus of the debate. Because the focus of the debate is whether or not the status quo is tenable, and it certainly is not, especially when 90 people die a day because we don't have universal background checks, which requires an affirmative ballot. Now, because these reforms I've mentioned are complementary, it means that compulsory voting does not lead to voter suppression. In fact, the reason why compulsory voting does not play into the efforts of Republicans to suppress the black vote is because, for instance, you are still able to cast a protest vote. You are still able to show up and register your attendance and then leave. You are still able to engage in forms of expressive protest within the system. There are also other ways that you can express freedom of speech, even if you feel like your freedom of speech would be perfect if you could just stay at home. But staying at home is not necessarily the most effective protest strategy. If enough people can actually vote none of the above, that could have sent a shockwave through the system that would force politicians to actually respond to the problems at hand. In addition, they've mentioned that there are extreme candidates, such as in Brazil, that if your only two choices are an extreme right individual and somebody that was being put up on fraud, like in Brazil you had Dilma Rousseff, who was going to get impeached, and then Jair Bolsonaro, who's the Trump of Latin America, if those are your only choices, it makes a lot of sense to vote none of the above. But if you have compulsory voting, there's at least a greater chance that you'll have more candidates that can appeal to the median voters' interests, and xenophobic parties tend to languish in obscurity, but they do not in the United States, because we have a system of voluntary voting where the priority is getting out the vote in a way that energizes your extreme racist base rather than actually trying to appeal to what all Americans can support, which means that compulsory voting is not only more democratic, but it is the only way to actually achieve an egalitarian system that deals with the rise of the demagogue and can also improve economic redistribution. Additionally, jury duty is analogous to compulsory voting insofar as compulsory voting is about compulsory attendance. When you're called in for jury duty, if you have a legitimate reason why you should not have to serve jury duty, then you're allowed to leave, but you still have to show up and perform that basic obligation. It's the same with compulsory voting. And additionally, it's a basic obligation that we have to support the institutions of democracy, because if so many people protest voted their way out of jury duty, then there would not be enough peers for you to have the right to a jury of your peers. We need to make sacrifices in order for others to have freedom, because freedom has always been bounded and constrained in every modern society, and we have to acknowledge historically too that it's often been constrained on the backs of the most oppressed individuals, like the way that American freedom was built on the backs of slaves. And now in this current historical moment, we have to acknowledge that in order to deal with systemic oppression, the costs of democracy must be borne by all people, which requires compulsory voting. There would not be a slippery slope or a precedent that undermines all freedom of speech, because we know that freedom is already bounded now. You cannot say fire in a movie theater. You do not have the right to a rocket or bazooka launcher just because of the Second Amendment. And even though voting might not rise to the level of safety for some of us, it definitely rises to that level for others, especially when you have the rise of the demagogues like Donald Trump that are putting the safety and health of people at risk. In addition, the quality of votes does not decline because voters are more likely informed in a world of compulsory voting. According to LACLA numbers, quote, in a study of 37 countries where compulsory voting is enforced, citizens have greater average levels of political knowledge. In Latin America, compulsory voting increases political discussion and attention in news, which means that if you know you have to show up, you're more likely to pay attention. And even if you protest vote, there are still statistics that demonstrate that policy platforms would change and become more progressive, and that'll save a lot of lives, which is far more important than a libertarian version of freedom that only hurts people.
today's debate boils down to a few main topics. One of the biggest ones that we disagree on has to do with the fact of uninformed voting. When it comes to individuals, like in the protest vote, when it comes to these individuals coming in and voting in their countries, we can see that it doesn't accurately represent or improve upon the current situation that we have. They only mention Australia as the shining knight of their the ideals that they're bringing up. We bring you multiple countries. I'm about to bring you one more of Thailand. Thailand has a compulsory voting system. If you look at their Thai Rak Thai Party, which is the leader and an owner of a telecommunications empire, according to the same Harvard source that I was mentioning earlier, they have the ability to cast a no vote option. They ended up having the largest share, 33% of the individuals coming in of all the votes being a no vote participant. If such a significant amount of people, and not only these places, but all these other countries, can show up and say that they disagree with the participants that are going on and not actually benefit the society that they're participating in, we don't see the benefit of actually having compulsory voting. We actually see this as an active harm on these individuals because, one, they're not benefiting anyone, and two, they're getting time and effort taken out of their day to come and just say the same thing that they would have if they hadn't voted in the first place. Next, let's bring up this idea that they're bringing in with all this social inequality that's going on and how compulsory voting is the solution to it. If they can take every idea that we brought up on our side that increases voter turnout and just add the tagline that compulsory voting has to be a portion of this, we wholeheartedly disagree because the source that we brought up, the American Center for Progress, states that compulsory voting is not impactful for this. These situations can happen without the use of compulsory voting. Every single one of these things allow for individuals of lower income statuses to come to the polls with easier voting, give them more knowledge about these votes, and gives them the autonomy and the freedom to come and choose whether or not they want to participate in this system whatsoever. If they have this knowledge and they have the ability to come and participate without the ability of suppression, which they haven't failed to, they failed to actually address all the ideas of suppression that are going on. If they have the ability to come and participate in these governments, it gives us the same benefits of actually getting in the healthcare, getting in the education, and getting in the job reform that we want, because we are still getting more voters that are still lower income enacting these policies. But if we ignore this fact, their case actually contradicts itself at the idea that all these leftist ideals, if we have compulsory voting, we're just going to have an influx of leftist ideals coming through moderate voters, which doesn't make sense. Universal health care, major education reform, and increase in job creation don't seem to be the things that major Republican parties actually advocate for a regular basis. The majority of their constituents don't vote for these ideals, and we can see that the case that they're making isn't going to have a major influx of these people come in. We're going to have moderate voters not voting for major leftist ideals. We're going to have moderate voters voting for moderate ideals, which is going to create more of a stalemate that we've seen than ever before. Finally, they bring up this idea of jury duty. We think that jury duty is an important part of the judicial system and that it cannot function without forcing individuals to come in and participate to have an equal and unbiased situation. We don't think that this actually constitutes the same response to the voting system, because individuals still participate in our society without being forced to. Our statistics show that individuals are highly likely to come out and vote with extra abilities for them to come and do so, such as non-voting, absentee ballots, voting at home, restoring formerly incarcerated individuals. Giving the ability for these people to actually come and vote is what's important, not forcing them to do so. Next, let's bring in the idea that they failed to mention about how Republicans in our society nowadays continuously and actively try voter suppression. They have no actual mechanistic claim of how we're going to get rid of this ideal, because of the fact that we still have individuals in Georgia and in Kansas actually creating policies now more than ever to stop individuals from voting in the first place. We can look at the governor of Kansas in specific, the Secretary of State in Kansas, where he pushed to obtain a proof of citizenship requirement now being a litigatable, which is now being litigated in court, that is a risk of disenfranchisement of over 7% of the eligible voters who don't have a passport or a birth certificate in the society. It's these kind of policies that they're going to try to enact more and more because they have been doing so with the increased voter turnout ever since the Voter Rights Act of 1965. We've seen an increase in gerrymandering, we've seen an increase in voter suppression, and this is only going to be exacerbated when the Republicans have no other choice than to forcing individuals to come in. We can only see that these policies get worse and worse. So in the end, we need to actually account for what's going on in our society. If we have an influx of non-valid votes coming in that don't change anything, and that is equivalent to the same amount of individuals who are not voting, we get no benefit from their side. We actually get a benefit from our side without the harms of compulsory voting by having these individuals get an increase in voter participation, and more importantly, active and interested voter participation rather than forcing them to do so. We think all of these points actually lead to a better society and a long-term benefit, because we've seen countries that have compulsory voting get more and more disenfranchised, such as the ones that we've mentioned, versus the one that they have.
Good debate.
Thank you. Good job.